In the 10 years since the novel project began, I have come to understand just how important our work in recovering texts really is. What I would like to do in the next few minutes is to theorize, if you will, the project or the history of Black writing. From the very beginning, the novel project was informed by two basic assumptions and an accompanying set of questions. Assumption one, reading and writing were dominant activities among Black people in the late 19th century, in the North as well as the South. One of the questions we wanted to ask in this regard was, what did Black people read? And how did writers conceive of their audience? Other related questions here include, what forms did writers choose to write in? What was considered serious literature? What was deemed popular? Where did writers publish? And how did a writer gain access to a community of readers? Assumption two, the number of actual texts by Black people is staggering, and they all require examination. For example, there are independently published newspapers, almanacs, documentary and institutional histories, individual and collective biographies and autobiographies, journals, and memoirs, to list a few. It would not be possible to understand the literary and aesthetic practices of Black people during the 19th century without a careful investigation of these forms. Our methodological approach is twofold. On the one hand, we have been careful to examine contemporary developments in revisionist and reconstructionist scholarship, including but not limited to African American studies, feminist criticism, Black women's studies, and literary theory. On the other hand, we are constantly making assessments of what we consider the limitations of these forms of scholarly inquiry.
This is interesting because I cannot tell you when this was, but what I'm thinking about is that that dialogue is all about Black print culture that we now talk about. So this is pre-Black print culture field of study. It's pre-material culture. All of these are areas that have grown out of, in my mind, Black studies writ large. But of course, we don't necessarily place them there when we talk about these new fields, the newly emerging fields. But it was just really clear to me that we were not doing the best job of investigating what was published, where it was published, and how that work continued to evolve. So we were at the beginning of this stage of HBW just trying to find stuff. You know, when we say literary archaeology, I guess the companion word is literary detectives.
So the implications of that, like I said, the notion of gender as a way of looking at, or does gender necessitate that understanding of gender, the difference between masculinization and feminization of historical moments, allow us to, or reading by the critics who are affected by one way of looking at it versus another, whether or not that should really be much more centered focus for us in these discussions. And I think if you look at McDowell's essays that have not already, you will find out that at the center of her discussion is this notion that we have constructed Douglas as the beginning of a particular kind of tradition, and it very much ties into our gendered notion of what that meant and what it means historically to have a male-centered tradition, or the male at the beginning of the tradition. Even so much as looking at the Adam and Eve, Adam being first, Eve being created from, and therefore also being dismissed, so that whatever happens there, even though she's secondary, she's also dismissed in the end. So that that all of these issues come up in that McDowell piece, which I find very interesting.
The value of the work that we're continuing to do really does necessitate ongoing archival work. And I guess that's where HBW has made its mark in terms of the emphasis on recovery and preservation, the second element of that, and dissemination, the third piece. If you recover the work, you have to preserve it but you have to make it accessible to more people. Otherwise, you'll be recycling that all over again. You'll lose it, even in the digital era. You will lose work if you're not discussing it. It'll be forgotten. But you're right. This issue of gender is part and parcel of the ways in which critical analysis, feminist theory, literary theory broadly intersects with the study of historic preservation. Literature is part of history. It is material culture. And when we're doing preservation, we have to think about the factors that contribute to what is preserved and what is not. So we're bringing along that baggage with us even when we're doing archival work. If an unpublished work by Frederick Douglass were to appear, it would get mega attention. When we began to talk about the start of a literary tradition and the emphasis shifts more toward looking at gender and the exclusions, we began to get incidents in the life of a slave girl, Harriet Jacobs. We began to discover what we missed, what we looked over. Because it's not that the book didn't exist. It's that the attention was not on that body of work. And Douglass fit a particular kind of model. Masculine, sort of centered on the self, masculinity, conquering someone who is your master, a sort of a soul-searching entry into freedom. You know, becoming a man. So manhood becomes very much co-identified with much of the tradition that's literary, and we know that that governed what it is that was important and was preserved. So that doesn't really change until well into the 20th century. And one marker that I would bring to our attention was the 1973 Phyllis Wheatley Festival at Jackson State College in Mississippi, organized and led by Margaret Walker, a poet herself, who was the person who made us clearly aware that Black woman was the head of a literary tradition, the start of it, and we need to honor her. That was the 200th anniversary of Phyllis Wheatley's poetry volume. Now, 50 years later, we're doing 250 next year. So this is important to recognize. Setting the record straight, which is another phrase that comes out of Margaret Walker's sort of practice. What is the truth here? But when you get those gendered readings, you have to become much more cognizant of how to untie the gendered part of it to the historically accurate part of it.
Well, I think that's what Rice tells us. I mean, what he did, he rebelled against that principle.
Beyond rebellion.
That's right. He was absolutely encouraging. And that would be, this would be the kind of child that one would say is encouraging. And that, you know, we can't do anything with it. It was best for him to leave. But you're right. I mean, one, you cannot disagree with the form of punishment. You can't talk back or explain. The biggest source in my family disputes is the fact of talking back. And they said, if you gave me the right to speak, why can't I talk back? And that's what I get all the time from all my children, 6 and 12. If I can talk, why can't I talk back? When I'm saying don't talk back to me, I mean, there's just no such concept in their mind. If I can speak and I have ideas, why can't I tell you those ideas?
Do you think the discipline was a form of teaching more than perhaps there was more discipline given to these children than was needed, but it was just really preparing them?
Well, I think it's very important to contextualize that experience. the discipline, the use of religious instruction. It's very important to contextualize. And certainly if you lift it out of the context and you look at forms of discipline, they will seem to be abusive. They will appear most abusive. Under any certain, by any such standard, they will be called abusive. And it may very well be, as has been suggested, that because of those, the likenesses of patterns of discipline to slave experiences, that people simply imitated those experiences in their training rituals of their children. That's one theory. The thing that I remember most sharply is the statement that any number of mothers, and I'll say my mother, my friends' mothers, because I would hear them in their discussion, I brought you into this world, and I can take you out. Now for me, that's the most abusive thing. You don't have to lay a hand on me. And I think about that when I get really angry, because that's the one thing I have never said. Because for me, you know, no amount of whipping, whatever, but it's just that one statement, I brought you into this world, and I can take you out.
What do you think they would answer you with?
This was, I guess, the 80s, 90s, mid-90s. These were those first summer institutes with school teachers, the NEH institutes. Those were some really valuable exchanges. We started doing college teachers later, but these were what I call teachers on the ground. They were working in public schools, inner cities, across the country. And they're confronting everyday reality. So you heard in that, and my sort of homespun wisdom, linking it to the everyday realities. I think what I really enjoyed about those institutes is that I had school-age children. So they were in school being taught by teachers that I had spent time in the summer with. In that particular institute, we had 3 rounds, I believe. NEH has changed a bit. And the same teachers could come together and study in the summer and go back enriched, refreshed, and able to face all of that was hitting at them. I think about how teachers today are being hit and fired, and what would have made a difference in their lives had they had this kind of network. So that network building was something I think that became central to HBW. Teachers working together, learning together over a period of time, and producing together. So that particular group of institute participants did something that none of our other institutes has so far done. They published a collection, Teaching African American Literature, Theory and Practice. And it was their ideas that they wanted to share with a larger public. And we simply became the mechanism for that happening. So that was one model that I think we could have done more of, and I'd like to see happen again. That is, you have people who are working together tirelessly over a period of time, you can produce something that comes out of that experience.
And you cannot claim that anyone has the right to an experience that may be common to a lot of people, the right to write about that experience. If you can write about it intelligently, convincingly, then there's nothing to say that you shouldn't do that. So the issue of ethics and morality and all of that sort of is implied, and I don't want to get into the debate of that, but all of those issues do come up in the slave narrative, production, creation of slave narrative, as it came up in the 1960s during the Black aesthetic movement. That is, who has the right to claim Or who has the authority to write about the black experience? Who has the authority to talk about the black experience and to teach the black experience? I remember, and I was one of those people who said nobody can teach about the black experience except black people. That's the generation that I was politicized now. And I say that because I no longer think that, but I did think that. Because it had to do with finding an identity and trying to claim authorship over that identity. And it was a question of power and control. Very little of which black people had, certainly in the academy. And so without having that power, the need to claim it was to claim an area of study that you could protect. And it also has something to do with the fact that some people who had been writing about that story had told lies. And so rather than have more lies told, you just say, you can't write about my story anymore. This is my story, I'm going to write about it. But that's an interesting moment. Needless to say, in the evolution of black studies as we know it today. Who can write about it, who can control it, who can talk about it. At other times, Mariah mentioned that when she talked about her experience in South Carolina, where there are times that when you have to legitimately say to people that your knowledge is insufficient. You may be a good scholar, but your knowledge is insufficient. And that's different from saying you can't write about it. But you have to sometimes tell people, all that you know is not sufficient. And so to help people draw the line or have sort of become a little bit more humble in their effort to learn, to be more sensitive, etc. So those are all issues, again, still of ethics and morality that are always a part of literature and culture. It cannot be separated.
We're talking about the evolution of black studies. How did it become institutionalized? How did it become a powerful force? And even though it is, you have to look at the changes in the academy and new studies, ethnic studies, women's studies, peace studies, all of those movements that led to different fields of study. The one that was most vexing for people was black studies, because that was an instance where, to use a phrase from a book, the empire talks back. That is, black people who were brought to a country and were expected to be docile, not to be grateful perhaps because they were brought to civilization, are now saying, we want to tell our own story. And so black studies represented a kind of rebelliousness, an attitude toward preservation again, but giving the fuller story. So the argument that existed at the time, and I confess that I was one of those people who said, we need to be teaching our own stories, and we need to be writing our own books, and we need to be blah, 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 blah. Well, we can't say that today. It's not possible. There is so much work to be done. We need everybody who wants to do it to do it. But what's accurate about the statement is that if you're going to do it, you have to be a scholar, a studious person who is going to take the time to get it right. And so if you can't be challenged in your view, then it doesn't make any sense. So rather than say, no, you can't tell the story, I think the more dialogues we have, the more debates we have, the more knowledge and truth emerges.
I come from a very, very long line of teachers, and a different kind of tradition perhaps of teachers. My mother taught in a county school system for many, many years, and it was not at all uncommon when Laura said, are we prepared to accept responsibility? It was not at all uncommon for my mother to go to school in the morning as if she was getting ready to dress her children. And so she took home and brushes and clothes and food, everything. And she did all of that in the hour before class began.
comb hair, give people breakfast, put clothes on their bodies, have consultations with those who are crying, call some parents, bless other parents out. So she really did take on the responsibility for doing things. And when she moved, that was when she was in the first and second grade. When she moved to fifth and sixth grade, she started working out after school activities that school could oversee, that children could do. And that was the era of sock hop and that kind of thing. And she had a relationship with some of the local disc jockeys in town who agreed at no expense to come and do record hops. That's what they call them, record hops for kids. And so the school would be the location for record hops after school. So along with sports and record hops, children would be in constructive activity in the afternoon. But it was teacher, directed, and it was the school was the place where this kind of thing went on. So perhaps Daryl's discussion about the church and other institutions that often, in his growing up, played critical roles. This might have been perhaps a transition period where the school did extend itself when there were teachers who were interested or who had a commitment to do it. Now, I was always there too with her, but she was essentially working with all these other children who did not have a structured program after school, either sports or other kinds of things. So I do think that to answer your question, sometimes we do have to take that responsibility. And I think it is an individual choice. I do not say, I think, to teachers that if you go into this profession, you must be prepared to do that, because different situations are different. But I think there are times when it does call or require us to do much more than we had bargained for.
We have to be careful, because when you start talking about what we've lost as a result of that transition from segregation to integration, you can easily be interpreted as being reactionary, which is what happened to Zora Neale Hurston, for instance. She was trying to make the point that you can't invalidate a community when you enter into an integrated environment. She was not saying we don't need change, progressive change. She was trying to say we have richness in these communities that we don't want to lose, and we don't want to ignore. So this is my spiel in terms of what, and again, a personal example with my mother, who taught in a county school during the era of segregation. I mean, the schools were supposed to be integrated, but the law and the practice were two different things. People lived in that county. It was an all-black county. There was no public school out there. And when they built one, my mother chose to go to that school and teach. And she had free reign. That is, you were not just teaching children, you were teaching parents. And so the school became a center for social and personal advancement, academic, intellectual advancement, the center of her life. So I guess if in the analysis of the institutions that are important to the black community, the church is the one that always comes up. The church is a central institution. People value it. People are organized around it. It's by and large segregated. It did not need to have a shift in that kind of focus. I'd say black schools, and that tradition of HBCUs represents that other key organization and institution. In this case, you're talking about segregated public schools. So I just don't want to go on record as saying, I think we should go back to the era of segregation. Hell no. I do think we should understand what we can take from that era and period that we might want to reinstitute. What were the lessons? Did we throw the baby out with the bathwater? So how do we reclaim some of that richness? Like I said, my mother was one of those teachers that did everything in the classroom. If you sang well, then your contribution would be to sing the school song for the morning. If you were a good talker or rhetor or rhetorically sound, you might be, and you were headed to be a minister, you might give the words of wisdom for the day. So you hold church in school, you have parties at school, you have meals at school. That's sort of full service. And I think that full service tradition followed itself into HBCUs. Full service provider. And I think that full service provision factor did get disrupted. But it doesn't mean that it's lost. And I use myself as a personal example because I say to people a lot is that I came out of an HBCU. I graduated from PWI. I went to a grad school at PWI, but my major professor had come from an HBCU. So I have this mixed education that brought together the traditions that I was able to absorb. And I'm pretty sure I take those values with me when I entered the academy. Not so much a full service provider, but the kind of holistic approach to developing the individual, to working together to reach someone's full potential. So there's this teacher spirit that pervades a lot of our culture, and we have probably demeaned that role in the public sector more than anything else. Underpaid, overworked, and now being kicked out for trying to do the right thing because they want to tell the true American story.